to the 20th edition of the Salt Lunchbox. We welcome you on Zoom and Facebook Live. You know the drill. I'm Dave. I'm the founder of Salt Sport and Life Training. We're a not-for-profit health organisation, and we're looking to really try and build upon this time into the positives that can emerge out of a difficult time in our history. So we come together 3 times a week in the aim of inspiring and connecting and taking away some really practical points that we can apply to our lives, and one call to action, one really practical thing we can do. As always, we have the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, the chat as well. So we'd love you to get involved and to chat, to make some comments. Sometimes we can comment on them and sometimes we can't. But James is always there answering wisely. We'd love to thank our sponsors, FC Business Solutions, Eastland and Bendigo Bank. Without their support, these sessions wouldn't be possible. So excited today. One of our intentions when we started the Salt Lunchbox was to bring people in who could talk about their lived experiences. And in terms of a life well lived, there would be few to rival our guest today. Les Twentyman, AO, raised in Braybrook, and has gone on to become one of Australia's best known social campaigners on issues such as homelessness, drug abuse, prison reform and social welfare. His decades of working with kids at risk has led him to become recognised as one of this country's leading experts on youth issues. So very big welcome to you, Les. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, David. Glad to be here. And
we'll also have Lane. Lane, you better come and join us as well. Lane is the chairman of SALT and founder of Yellow Box Careers and a director at Roses in the Ocean, and always gets good feedback in regards to his comments. We haven't got Ed today, but Ed will be with us on Wednesday when we have Scotty talking about humour, and Ed will be running the session on Friday for those who are fans of Ed Weiner. Welcome, Lane.
Good to be here, mates, and excited to get the opportunity to have a listen to what Les has got to say. His work stands alone, doesn't it? It's amazing what he's done and continues to do.
Yep. So, Les, you're not actually a young bloke anymore. So how have the past 6 to 8 weeks been for you?
Not too bad. My wife works from home, and so she's been sort of doing this for a few years, so it was easy to fall into that culture. But of course, it just goes to show just how much we really rely on connections with other people. You know, computers are fantastic and all that, but they can't take you down to the coffee shop to have a coffee or have a beer at the pub. You know, people need people, and I can't wait until the next couple of weeks to just flow by so we can get back to some sort of connectedness again. And you know, particularly young people who are involved in team sports and things like that, you know, it must be extremely difficult for them. Because if I was 14 and 15 doing this, I'd be really doing it hard.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm a long way north of that. So, yeah.
Les, just tell us really briefly how you got into this space and a little bit about the journey in just a minute or so.
I was a school teacher, and I was working at an all-girls college where I was a phys ed there for 5 years and 4 years at an all-boys school. And then I went to a primary school in Collingwood. And one boy, a young boy in grade 3, came to the staff room this day, and we're going to go across into the high-rise flats in Wellington Street, Collingwood, the game of Tippity Run. So I asked him if he could grab the stumps, and as he reached up to get the stumps, the sleeve of his arm came down, and I noticed there were 3 black marks on it. So I called him over, and he was very embarrassed, but it turned out to be cigarette burns. So I went to the headmistress after school and told her how distressed I was about that, and she went on to tell me a lot of the kids out of the high-rise flats, you know, coming from those type of families. So I made a decision then. That's where I wanted to be, and been doing it for 40 years.
40 years. So tell me, how have kids changed, and have their issues changed over those 40 years?
Look, early days, it was generally about what time to get home on a Saturday night. The kids wanted to come home on the last train at midnight. parents wanted them home about 9:30, 10 o'clock. So if I was able to go in there and negotiate between the family or the parents and the child, get an extra hour, so both were winners. You know, and there was hardly any drugs around. Well, sadly, that all changed very quickly because kids don't go out generally until the last train and come back about 2 days later in some cases and have been on benders and things of that nature. The job as youth work has become extremely dangerous over the past decade, mainly because of methamphetamine. And we're seeing that in the papers every day. Very famous sports people, you know, have sort of succumbed to this terrible substance. So, you know, we don't want those sort of things contaminating team sport because we view sport as a tool to straighten a lot of wobbly kids' lives up. And they've gone on with it. You know, one kid was homeless and when he was about 15, he wanted to go back to school. So his youth worker brought him to us. We gave him brand new textbooks. He went on to win a scholarship to Oxford University, where he qualified as a mathematician and now runs his own artificial intelligence agency back here in Melbourne. And we've got story after story. One sports story is that one of the schools rang me one day and said, Les, we've got a young African boy who's, you know, causing a lot of grief. He's in a gang and all that. You take him on. So I met with him for about a month or so, every second day. Wasn't going anywhere. All of a sudden I got a call from Jeannie Pratt to say that they were bringing Muhammad Ali to the 1998 grand final. So I said to this young boy, I said, listen, Muhammad, if you go back to school for the rest of the semester and don't get into trouble, I'll take you to meet Muhammad Ali. He said, oh, crap. I said, okay. So anyhow, we did that. So on the morning of the grand final, with our bus, the Les Twentyman Foundation bus, I went to our refuge that we've got in Sunshine. I picked up 6 homeless kids from there, and I go to pick up Muhammad and his brother, and they've come out in tuxedos. I said, boys, we're going to the footy. We're not going to the wedding. And Muhammad said, no, we're going to meet the most famous man in the world. So we get down to where we're all going to meet. There's 60 kids out of boxing clubs and all that. Alex Jesselenko said, Les, can you introduce your kids to Muhammad when I bring him along? So I've got the 2 African boys in tuxedos beside me and the other 6 homeless kids from our refuge. So as Muhammad comes up to me, I introduced myself and I said, Muhammad, meet Muhammad. So he gave me a bit of a look and you wouldn't believe it. His brother's name was Ali. And I said, Muhammad, meet Ali. And he turned around and I went, you know, but anyhow, some years later, I was in a shopping centre and the same boy came out and he said, Les, it's Muhammad. And I said, oh, how are you? He said, I'm now 29. I've got a 9-year-old boy. And every time I see you on TV, I tell my son, that's the man who changed my life. But it wasn't. It was that kid meeting Muhammad Ali. He and his family of 16 saw their parents beheaded and their nanny. So they had this terrible trauma. And all of a sudden, because they met someone like Muhammad Ali, that changed that kid's life for the better. So sport's been extremely important to me. I've probably brought in about $40 million into the western suburbs, you know, the youth refuge built, all those sorts of things. And it's all came about because of my football and sporting connections, you know, because I captain coach football, VFA with the Yarraville, assistant coach at Williamstown and Premiership, you know, and a lot of those people who played in those teams are still with me today. In fact, 2 of my board members, you know, one was my vice captain when I was captain coach in 1975, John Hyatt. The other one, Mike Good, who played with me down at Williamstown. He, as I said, is on the board as well. So, you know, our chairman's Dr. David Young, the most famous surgeon for the sports people. He's done all the Australian cricketers, does the Sri Lankan cricket, Lauren Jackson, you know, and he's been really great because every time he has a patient in who's got some sort of clout, and there's a little quick funny story that when the guy Barry Hall came to Sydney to come and play for the Bulldogs, he had a bit of floating bone in his foot. So the club sent him to David, and David did that and then said, look, Barry, I'm involved with the Les Twentyman Foundation. We've got a Christmas party coming up and we need a Santa Claus. And Barry said, no. He said, well, Barry, there's two things that can happen here. You can have a pain-free rehabilitation, or you can have a terrible, painful one. He said, okay, but I'm not putting that Santa suit on. So, you know, these are the sorts of things that we have a bit of fun in. Like Doug Hawkins comes, we've had 35 Christmas party for, gosh, we had about 600 there, 500 kids and parents, you know, and he's been to every one of those parties. I don't know if he's there to help Santa or to knock some of the presents off, but, you know, he's fantastic. And we have Jordan Ruffhead comes along, Sam Newman's been about 10 times, you know, and the kids absolutely love seeing these stars that they normally only see on TV, but not just with them, handing out the Christmas present and taking a real interest in their lives. So, you know, Luke Beveridge has been there.
Let me interrupt you, Les. Let me interrupt you just there, because I want to come back to the kids and their friends.
Yep.
And we really appreciate your comments around the impact that sports people can have. There was a study done by La Trobe University back in 2014, the Centre for Sport and Social Impact, in which it said that typically if you invest in a sporting club, it's worth $4.40 in social return, that they're typically 3 times more connected than school or work, and that they have much greater influence over other people. Now, obviously, sports stars, Muhammad Ali or whoever it is, have tremendous influence. But let's just talk about the influence of friends over friends and the importance of choosing our friends well, and what you would say to parents, particularly in regard to helping their children make good decisions around the friends that they choose and what kind of conversations we need to be having with our kids.
Well, I grew up in a place called Braybrook, and those that don't know Braybrook, it's a place if you pay your rent on time, the cops want to know where you knocked the money off from. But one end of my street, where I lived, there was only about 3 teenagers, and we're very heavily connected into sport. At the other end of the street were young people that were into knocking over gas meters and all those sorts of things, those old days, you know, and they all ended up in trouble. When Lester Ellis won the World Championship, he and I went into the Remand Centre to address 400 prisoners. In the second row, there are 3 kids that lived in my street. And I thought to myself, if I'd have been knocking with those kids, I could have been the 4th one sitting beside them. It's the luck of the draw, but you just got to be so careful that you know, who you choose. And that's why I think it's really important where team sport comes in, because there's structure, there's discipline, you know, there's teamwork and all those sorts of things. You know, as one of my youth workers says, if you're a 16-year-old pot smoker from St Albans, all you hang around with is 16-year-old pot smokers. So that is probably very simplistic, but it is so important. We set up a basketball club called the Redskins. Used to be 2 gangs that fought each other in Footscray. It closed the school down over the semester break. So what we did is, you've got one of our workers with one gang and the other with the other. We brought those 2 gang leaders together the Thursday before second semester, where we brokered a deal so the school could open. Funny enough, both gangs loved playing basketball. So immediately set up a basketball club. We had 8 teams, we had no ball, and then had one lot of shirts or singlets. And so if the whole 8 teams played on the one night, if you're in the last team, your singlet had been on 7 other bodies. They used to think that hygiene was just a very tall girl. But anyhow, from an article in the Herald Sun, people started to ring up, and one of them turned out to be the Australasian chairman of the Deutsche Bank, and he put all this money in. Now we've got 333, I think, kids playing, and out of that, about 60 do a 2-year leadership course. And some of those kids that were in a lot of trouble now work full time for us, you know, and that's mainly because of the sporting structure, particularly with some of the refugee kids who've got parents who can't speak English. Once they get connected, you know, they're playing the basketball, the families come along, and that's where they get involved with our youth workers and all that sort of stuff. So they're not just watching their kids playing, they're actually getting involved in the community where they build up friendships, and we take them to the footy, or we take them to things like War Horse and all those sorts of things, the Marriott and that sort of So we try as much to make this a family foundation, because the family is the most powerful thing in any young person's life. If it's dysfunctional, then kids are in for a rough ride. And if they're in for the rough ride, that's when they need someone like an outreach youth worker to be able to help out. We've got youth workers in 4 schools in the eastern suburbs, and their job is to support kids who are having trouble. Now, there's 4 winners. The kids are winner because you've got a support worker. The kids' families are winner because they've got a resource. The schools are winner because they're not suspending this kid anymore. And we, the community, are the winners. Those kids aren't out in the, running around the community, breaking into houses and things like that. You know, that's how important. It's $500,000 to lock a kid up for 12 months. With that sort of money invested in the sport, and particularly in the youth workers, we could save this country multiple millions of dollars every week.
Lane, I just want to throw to you. Sorry, I've left you there for so long. And also ask you that question. I was talking to you earlier, and sometimes when we're talking to our kids about their friends, we can come across as sounding really judgmental, or we've got a vested interest in who they hang out with. So how would you suggest that we have the conversations with our kids around their choice of friends?
Yeah, great question. Can I just say that I think one of the things that we need to understand as parents is that the way friendships were formed and the way friendships functioned back in our day is very different to the way friendships are formed and the way friendships function now. We didn't have social media. We didn't have, all of that other stuff. We didn't have Netflix and, Foxtel and all these sorts of things. We went out and played cricket. We went out and played footy, and when it got too dark to see the ball, you came back in and you had your dinner and you went to bed. So I think it's, as parents, one of the things that we can often do is become very biased or judgmental about what the nature of those relationships need to look like, without respecting the fact that things have shifted and changed, and our assumptive worldview about what's right and wrong, or the way a friendship needs to look, isn't necessarily the assumptive worldview of kids growing up these days. And I think, from my perspective, if you spend a lot of time working hard on building the right values into your kids when they're little, you've got to trust them to start making the right decisions when they get a little bit older. What Les is talking about is something, incredibly powerful, and that is these kids come from broken homes, and he mentioned trauma before. Many of these kids come from trauma-based environments where there's lots of complicated grief attached to that. And when that happens, they gravitate to stability, and where that stability is found is often in people that become their pseudo-family because they can't get that stability from their actual family. So try as best we can to build stable environments for our kids. I remember having a conversation once with a guy in a club who said to me, "I'm worried about my son. What should I do?" I said, "The first thing you've got to do is make sure you keep talking to him. Because the moment you stop talking and the moment you guys can't communicate, you've lost the battle." So the first thing, even if sometimes that means we've got to shut up, the first thing we've got to do is keep the lines of communication open. So when issues are there, at least we can talk about it.
Yeah. I'd like to just bring up too the aspect of asking good questions rather than making kind of big statements. So if we were to ask our kids questions like, when you're with them, those particular friends, how do you feel? Do you feel energized and lifted up? Do you feel positive? Or do you feel like you're having to be someone who you're not? Do you feel like it's kind of exhausting and tiring? And I think these are important questions, because when the kids process the answers, we can ask some more questions like, do you feel like this is a good group for you to be in? And they can come to their own conclusions rather than feel like, their parents are kind of pushing them in a certain direction. And I come back to you, Les. If I think as kids, perhaps when we look back, we can all remember times when we felt like we were in the wrong friendship group. And even as adults, we have to be pretty careful about who we surround ourselves with. So if you're in a friendship group and you feel like it's going downhill, what would you say to a kid?
Look, I've written a book. It's called The Mouth That Roared, and there's a couple of stories on that exact question. That is, I was in Barwon prison one day, and I was speaking to about 40 or so prisoners, and one of them was sitting up the front, and he kept on asking all these really intelligent questions. And the last question he said to Les, "How come you can't become a youth worker even if you haven't got any priors for sexual sort of offences and that. And I just said, oh, well, maybe it's because of the Russell Street bombing. And next minute there's this hush and the guy jumps up to his feet. He said, it wasn't me, it was my co-offender. And that was Craig Minogue. But why I bring that up is he got into crime because his youth worker was into crime. That was a guy called Taylor in Hang Around the Flats. So these kids drifted because of that relationship with that youth worker into, well, in this case, maybe the rest of his life in jail. And that's how simple it can be. So, you know, and we've seen now with some of the football coaches and that sort of stuff making the front pages for not all the good reasons and those sorts of things. And that's why we've got to make sure, you know, as the founders of the great sporting things, that we've got to make sure that the right people are in there, because if you haven't got that, then not only does your club fall apart, but also that person falls apart, and then the family falls apart. So going to your question, look, Lane was so right. You've got to communicate, communicate and communicate. Now these days, it may be difficult. A lot of kids have been brought up by grandparents, and the culture is just so much different from where their grandkids are. And this is why we say, you know, you've got to contact your local youth services, whether it's the local council or the Les Twentyman Foundation. There's a program that's a government sponsor called Youth Support Service. And that's where police might identify a young guy saying, he's not a bad kid, but if he's going to knock around with Les Twentyman, he's going to be in a lot of trouble. So the copper speaks to the kid, speaks to the family. If they all agree, they refer him to the Les Twentyman Foundation youth workers, and those youth workers work with them intensively for the next 6 months and get those kids back on track. So it's not rocket science. You know, some years ago it said how a country community decided between themselves and the police and the magistrates to give these kids, first offenders, an opportunity. If they go to the footy club or netball club with their youth worker for 4 weeks, you know, they wouldn't come up on the leap offensive stuff. And in some cases, there are still kids 20 years down the track, still with those sporting clubs because of that way they got in there, got positive relationships going, and their lives got back on track. You know, that's one of the difficulties today, of course, is country football, which I've been part of. I coached Melton in the Riddle League. You know, the community are the big winners of that. So to be able to play these games with no community or spectators is, you know, basically worthless, other than the fact that the players may get fitter. You know, communities rely so heavily on their sporting clubs, particularly in regional areas. If they're contaminated, then these kids are trapped. And this is why it's important for youth workers, sports coaches, school teachers, you know, police. We're all on the same team. We just play in different positions.
I know that as a school counsellor, and Lane, you might be able to talk about this a little bit as well. If a kid was in a negative friendship group, it was often very difficult to remove himself or herself from it because they fear maybe being bullied by that group, or you know, how it might look to, or how it might feel just to be lonely and have no friends. And so actually extricating yourself is really difficult. But I was talking to Les earlier, and he said, by filling your life with other positives. So rather than just separating yourself, saying things like, I've got to go to footy training or choir training or whatever it is, I've got some interest in my life that is all consuming now, rather than saying I'm leaving you as a group. But what would you say, just as we come towards the end, Lane, in terms of helping kids, if they are in a negative group, to move on?
Yeah, mate, one of the things that I'm really big on is the idea of stigma, and at the very heart of stigma is treating people in a different way or negatively because of, you know, who they are or what they do. What we've got to recognise, I think, with a lot of young kids who might be a bit troubled is there's actually a lot of self-stigma going on before we even start. So they've already got a mindset about themselves, you know, I'm this or I'm that, or I come from a broken home, or my dad's an alcoholic, or I'm not going to amount to anything. So there's a lot of internal stuff going on before we even actually begin to apply stigma to them. So from my perspective, I think the first thing we've got to do is accept people as they are and as they come to us with unconditional positive regard. And we've got to look at people in a positive light and do whatever we can to help that individual to find a different way. And then when we find improvement, we've got to recognise it, we've got to compliment it, we've got to acknowledge it, we've got to validate it, we've got to help them see that any movement towards something that's more positive than their current circumstance is a very positive step forward in their life, and give them lots of affirmation around that.
No, terrific. And we did have a question, Les, and just in a minute or so, but how would you talk to kids today in regard, if they come from different ethnic backgrounds and have different attitudes towards women, how do you navigate that, was a question that came through from the panel.
Yeah, look, that's obviously complicated, and because of technology, people can be bullied over without even leaving their home and things like that. But yeah, look, we've got our youth workers, we've got, you know, a sort of very, very skillful bunch of different ages and different ethnic backgrounds, and they all come together basically with our sports. So as I said, we've got a big basketball club, and also we had some arts and dramas, just working together. And I noticed, I had the Chief Commissioner, Ken Lay, come to our basketball one night, and he said, Les, you know, look, there's Muslims and there's Africans and there's, you know, all sorts of Maori. And he said, don't you have any trouble? I said, no, they see each other as friends and teammates. I said, really? I said, that's the way. There's a quick story. There was a mob of boys one day in Footscray, and they run up to attack these three young kids coming out of McDonald's. And one of the mob of the 15 said, don't hit that little kid. He's in my basketball team. He's our captain. He's our best player, and we're in the grand final. Now, if the whole three kids had been in the basketball, no one would have probably got injured. But that's how, you know, I know it sounds silly, but it's so true. Be part of something positive, and people want to be part of positive with you, and that just becomes infectious.
No, thank you, Les. I'm going to share my screen and just go through three salient points. Who our kids choose to associate with can tell the whole story of how their life is going to play out. So those really important decisions about who I'm going to surround myself with, and as adults too, just again choosing to surround ourselves with positive people that energise us, and rather than you know, sap our energy. Number two, empowering youth with choices around how they want to live their lives can be life altering. And so giving them those opportunities. You've talked a lot about sport today, Les, but any opportunity to do something that they feel like is engaging and positive and in their strength zone. We know that the kids who often end up in the gangs are those who haven't filled their lives with the other positive things that might be available to them. And thirdly, connecting young people with positive role models and mentors is the key to them overcoming disadvantage. So just having that adult in a society where the village mentality is less than it used to be, I think as adults, if we can just connect into one or two kids who might be struggling and be that voice of reason and ask good questions. And so the next one, the point of action, says, think of one young person who you know who may need a hand to make good decisions, and be prepared to invest into their lives. And you know, I think today we've got to be a little bit careful, because there can be suspicion attached to adults working with kids. So we do that in an open space and with the knowledge of their parents. And again, it's a great role for coaches to be able to play, but there might be just a kid who comes across your path and you're a different voice, and you say, I'm happy to catch up and ask you good questions and just help you to make good decisions. So I think that's really important. Our own SALT presenter, Scott Angove, is a teacher, but he's also a stand-up comedian, and he delivers at the Comedy Club. And he's going to come and talk to us on Wednesday about the science of humour. He's going to share a few of his jokes. We've had to make sure that we put the beep button on when we're showing him live at the Comedy Club, because it's colourful at times. But he's actually very, very listenable and funny man. And Ed Werner will be with us as well. And she will talk as well just about how we can reduce stress, how we can diffuse conflict with humour used well. We know sometimes in sporting clubs it can be overused and abused even at times. You know, it can be too personal and hurtful, but used well, humour is a powerful tool. We want to thank our great sponsors, FC, Eastland and Bendigo Bank. Thank you so much. If you miss out on sessions, you know you can go to YouTube or to our website and link onto the YouTube or a Facebook site to catch up on anything that you've missed. That's our Salt Reconnect session, which we did just recently, and lots of good tools. We're developing a heat map so that as they talk, it starts to develop some of the themes again in a really interesting visual way. So contact Salt for that, info@sportandlifetraining.com.au. That's the number for Lifeline. You'd be well aware of that, Les. There's a wonderful organisation. And so as we come to the end, and I look at my clock, it's 1:30. Les, thank you so much for all that you've done. Sorry that time flew. Thank you, Lane. Thanks, listeners. Please join us again on Wednesday for Scotty Angove and humour and mental health. Thanks, everybody.